Hello everybody! Welcome to what I think is probably my favorite video that I make every year, and that is my year of reading in review. I am going to be looking at all of my book and reading statistics for 2019. I just love statistics and graphs and info like this so much, and I'm just excited to look at all of the books that I read in 2019 and break them down into different categories and look at the different trends of my reading. It's gonna be a good time. For the past couple years, I've done my year in review as one giant video, and I've done like looking at my goals in review, my reading statistics, and my favorite and least favorites of the year. And this year, I'm gonna be breaking all of those up into separate videos. So today, we're just gonna be looking at my statistics for 2019. And I'm just gonna be popping up a bunch of graphs. I don't keep like a formal spreadsheet like a lot of you do. I have attempted to set one up a couple times in the past, and I just don't love it. I am a classic pen and notebook kind of gal, I guess. At the beginning of the year, I mapped out everything that I wanted to keep track of for 2019, and then every time I read a book, or every few books that I read, I would sit down and I would write the book into my list of books for the year, and then I would go through and I would fill out the information for every category in regards to that book. So this is all done by hand. It's all done off of memory. I know that I made a couple minor mistakes throughout this. There might be things that I might have mislabeled, things that I might have forgotten. I just wanted to give that caveat. This is all just done by me. It's not professionally created statistics by any sort of means. Let's get into it. In 2019, I read a total of 116 books. This is a pretty low number for me, and I'm not super happy about it, but it is what it is. 116 books. I read a total of 32,836 pages across those books. Most of it was audiobook listening, obviously, but I mean, I just took the total amount of pages from the book itself based on whatever the hardback version of the book was. So in breaking this down month by month, in January I finished 7 books for a total of 2,117 pages. In February I read a total of 15 books for a total of 4,223 pages. I participated in Contemporary-a-thon in February, so that was probably part of the reason that's a higher number on that month. March, I read 11 books with 3,235 pages. In April, I read 10 books at a total of 2,619 pages. In May, I only read 6 books, total of 1,794 pages. June, I read 8 books. Again, not too great. Total of 2,691 pages. In July, I participated in the Reading Rush, and I also did the 24 and 48 readathon that I did. That was just a personal readathon that I participated in. I read a total of 15 books in July at 3,737 pages. So that was a little bit better. August, something to note would be that I was doing Veda in August. I read a total of 10 books at 2,175 pages. In September, I participated in Contemporary-a-thon again, and I read a total of 10 books at 3,614 pages. October, I read 11 books, 2,620 pages was the total for that month. November, I think was probably my worst month of the whole year. I read 5 books at a total of 1,793 pages. And then December, I read 8 books at 2,218 pages. So yeah, there were definitely ups and downs. There were quite a few months where I didn't read much at all. 5 in November, I think, is my worst month. May and June, that was also kind of a slumpy time for me. I read 8 books in June and then 6 in May. And then my 2 best months for reading were July and February. I read 15 books in both of those. Contemporary-a-thon, I know, definitely helped me in February, and then the Reading Rush and 24 and 48 definitely helped me in July. So readathons definitely help boost my reading. It doesn't look to me like there's any sort of specific trend in terms of like, I read more in the summer versus the winter. There's just kind of natural ups and downs all throughout the year for me. In terms of page numbers, the shortest and longest book books that I read were actually both read in April. In April, I read 2 children's picture books by Taro Gomi that were both 24 pages long. And then I also read Fosse by Sam Wasson, which was definitely my longest book of the year. It was 723 pages, so that one was a chunker. The second longest book that I read was Lethal White by Robert Galbraith. That one was 650 pages. So I think those are definitely the 2 longest books I read all year. I, in general, don't tend to read books over 500 pages. So those were kind of anomalies for me. So yeah, that is the overview of how much I was reading. Let's start breaking all of my books down into categories. That's my favorite thing. So I kept track of lots of different stuff throughout the year. I'll just do it in order of what's in my notebook here. So the first thing I have is age range. I read 6 children's books, 20 middle grade books, 53 YA books, 3 books that I categorized as new adult, and then 34 books in the adult category. This is pretty much what I would expect. I mostly read YA. I really love YA fiction, but there's a decent chunk of adult books, a decent chunk of middle grade, a handful of children's. I do like to read all across the board. I'm pretty happy with that. I do want to read, I think, maybe a little bit more adult, a little bit more middle grade, and maybe lighten the load of young adult fiction, but I'm not mad about this distribution of age ranges. And of course, I do wish that I was reading more like new adult, but it's not really an age range that is published or marketed, so I just kind of will personally classify a book as new adult if I feel like it should be in that age range. I wish more new adult books existed. Next up, we have publication year. I already went into this with the video I think that went up yesterday where I was looking at my goals in review. So I did have a reading goal to read older books in 2019, and obviously that didn't happen. I already talked about what my totals were, but I will repeat them here just for the sake of this video. We had 1 book published from like 1900 to 1909, 1 from the 1950s, 1 from the 60s, 4 from the 70s, 2 from the 80s, 9 from the 90s, 15 books from the 2000s, so the first decade of the 2000s. And then I did break it down year by year after that. So we have 3 from 2010, 4 from 2011, 1 from 2012, 3 from 2013, 5 from 2014, 6 from 2015, 9 from 2016, 9 from 2017. Then we've got 18 books published in 2018 and 25 books published in 2019. Once again, the majority of the books I was reading were new releases. I've said this before and I'll say it again. It's never my intention to be reading only new releases. It's not something I care about and something I strive for, but it just really happens naturally, especially when you get recommendations from other booktubers who are reading new releases, and also on book Twitter you see new releases all the time. That's like what my library peddles to me constantly, is the new releases that they've just added to the catalog. So it ends up being what I pick up for the most part. I definitely would like to see a more even distribution throughout the years. Ignoring the fact that I failed on my goal, this is kind of what I would naturally expect the breakdown to be in my reading. Moving into genre. This was an interesting one. Last year, I was kind of shocked by how many contemporary books I read. And this year, it's pretty similar, but I don't think I had quite as hard of a contemporary lean this year than I did last year. I think I have my stats from last year right here in my notebook. Over 50% of the books that I read last year were contemporary, and that's not the same as this year. That actually does make me happy. I'm not trying to read fewer contemporaries because I love it, and I never feel like I've read too much contemporary fiction, but I do want to explore other genres as well, and I think that I did that to an extent this year. Here is my genre breakdown. There were 4 books that I categorized as I don't know, and what I think that was children's books. I have a huge struggle trying to categorize children's books into genres, especially books that are about animals that are like anthropomorphized. I don't know where to put those. Like, it's not contemporary, but it's not really fantasy either. Like, I don't ever know where to put children's books that have anthropomorphized animals. So I'm pretty sure that's what my I don't know genre was, but I honestly, like, I've been filling this out throughout the year, so I'm not 100% sure what those were, but there were 4 books that I did not know how to categorize. Moving into the actual genres, we have 4 historical fiction novels, 4 fantasy books that I would consider like high fantasy, 8 nonfiction reads, 4 sci-fi novels, 1 supernatural paranormal book, 12 mystery books. I am continuing to develop my love of mysteries. This makes me really happy that this was one of the bigger genres. Obviously, it's not like a huge chunk of this graph, but I read more mysteries than most other genres that we're gonna go into. I also read 12 mystery novels in 2018. That's definitely something that I want to continue into 2020. I love that I've kind of found like a rekindled love of that genre. We have 4 books that I categorized as mostly romance, 3 thrillers, 3 books that I categorized as apocalyptic, 4 books that I thought were primarily horror novels, 2 memoirs. The next one is kind of a bigger one as well. I have 21 books that I categorized as urban fantasy. This is definitely a huge jump up from last year. I guess I was really leaning into the urban fantasy. I didn't really notice that I was doing that this year, but I'm not surprised or mad about this. If I'm reading a book that has magic in it, I strongly prefer an urban fantasy that has like a real world setting with magical elements versus a high fantasy novel that takes place in a different world. That makes me excited as well, just to see a different genre that's not straight up contemporary being tended to a little bit more. You know, I'm glad that I have been branching out a bit. Next up, we have 3 dystopian books, 4 poetry books, and then of course the final category, 35 contemporary books. So yes, it is definitely the majority of the books that I read, but it's not more than half. It's more of an even spread. I'm pretty happy with this breakdown. In the next year, I would love to see more sci-fi. I really want to read more sci-fi and get into sci-fi more, so I would love to see that be a bigger chunk than it is. But yeah, that's interesting, and I'm pretty happy with that breakdown. Moving on to my ratings that I gave books. I didn't give anything half of a star. I honestly don't think I ever have given a half-star rating. It just like isn't really an option on Goodreads, and it just, I don't know. 1 is pretty much the lowest I go. So there was 1 book that I gave 1 star. No books got 1.5. I did give 5 books 2 stars, 6 books 2.5 stars, 29 books 3 stars, 42 books 3.5, 24 books 4 stars, 4 lonely books got 4.5 stars, and then there were 5 books that I gave 5 stars. But I do have to say that all 5 of those books that I gave 5 stars were rereads, and I had previously given them 5 stars in the past. I was expecting to give them 5 stars again. So there were literally no books that I read for the first time in 2019 that I gave 5 stars to. I'm really disappointed by this. I can't believe that I didn't pick up a 5-star book for the entire year. I did read some really great books, but I just didn't read a book that hit me in the way that I generally do when I give a book 5 stars. And I'm so sad about this. I would say in general, I give maybe 1 to 3 5-star ratings in any given year to new books that I'm reading for the first time, but not giving any at all. I don't know. There's something like wrong with that. I don't know what it is. And then only 4.5 star ratings. That's also not very much at all. But anyway, this is pretty much what I expect. I always am really heavy on the 3 and the 3.5 star ratings. For the most part, I'm not surprised by this, but I am a little bit disappointed by the lack of 5-star ratings. The next category that I have is the format in which I read all of these books. So surprising nobody, 95 of the books that I read were on audiobook. 15 of the books I read were physical. That's gonna cover the poetry that I read, some graphic novels that I read, and some of the children's books that I read. There definitely were not any like novels that I read in the physical form. 4 of the books that I read were ebooks. Again, some combination of graphic novels and children's books. And then I read 2 books on the combination audiobook and ebook. And I believe that those were both children's books where I got copies of the audiobook and then I also read along with the ebook from my library. So I was able to do both at the same time because obviously I want to get the pictures as well as listening to the audiobook. Next up, we have the time period that the books that I read were taking place in. So 15 books I read took place in the past. 83 took place in the present. Not surprising that that's so big because, again, I read so much contemporary. 4 of the books I read were in the future. I read 5 books that took place across multiple timelines. And then I classified 9 books as just like not applicable because they took place in like magical realms. A high fantasy novel or a sci-fi novel that takes place in a different world is not going to be on the same timeline that we live in. So there's no way for me to quantify that. Not super surprising results for this. So for my stats for 2020, I have so far been keeping track of everything the same way that I did in 2019. I'm keeping the same categories and the same system, but I do want to let you know of any changes that I'm going to make for the upcoming year. And I think this is the first one, is that I do want to keep track of what time periods the books that I read took place in the instances where they weren't in the present. So I'm curious, in the smaller instances where I'm reading historical fiction, how far into the past I was reading about, and if I have any trends of specific time periods that I tend to read about, because keeping track of just the past, present, and future doesn't give me a lot of information. Next up, we have countries represented. So these might be the main setting of a book, but it also might be a smaller section of the book where the characters like took a trip to a country. I included any instance of traveling from country to country in these statistics. I have 15 books that took place in England, 87 books taking place in the United States. Then we've got 2 in the Philippines, 5 in Canada, 1 in Poland, 4 in France, 1 in Iran, 4 in Scotland, 3 in Germany, 1 in Tunisia, 2 books in China, 1 in Japan, 2 in Mexico, 1 in Wales, 2 in Ireland, 1 from Switzerland, 1 from Egypt, 1 from Austria, 1 from the Czech Republic, 1 from Australia, 1 in Thailand, and 1 in Italy. These are all the countries that I traveled to via literature in 2019. I'm not super impressed by this. I would love to read more globally than I did. I definitely would love to see books that depict different places in Africa. Definitely more books that take place in South America. I don't even know if I have a single one. I don't think I do. I also looked at the US states that were represented in the books that I was reading, and I found that to be super interesting to look at this. So 11 of the books that I read that took place in the United States, I just couldn't figure out what state they took place in. 2 of them I narrowed down to the tri-state area, but I could not figure out specifically which state within that. And then there was 1 book that took place in New England, and again, I just couldn't figure out the specific state. But I do have a whole list of actual states of all of the books that I read that took place in the US. So we've got 2 from Florida, 1 from Colorado, 24 books that took place in New York. This was by far the highest represented state in the US. I was expecting it to be, but I didn't expect it to be that much. I'm kind of shocked by how many books I read that took place in New York. And it was surprising to me because obviously a lot of them took place in New York City. That's a very common place for books to take place. But I also read a ton of books that took place in like upstate New York in smaller towns. And I just didn't realize that so many books I read take place in New York. And we've got 4 from Pennsylvania, 2 that took place in Utah, 16 in California. Again, not surprising that California is the next highest represented state. New York definitely is biggest, and then California after that. Then we have 3 that took place in Washington State, 4 in Illinois, 4 in Vermont, 3 in Oregon, 1 in Georgia, 7 that took place in Massachusetts, so that one was a higher one as well, 4 in Ohio, 4 in Minnesota, 1 in Idaho, 1 in Tennessee, 10 that took place in Texas. I believe Texas is the 3rd highest represented state. All the rest of these are pretty smaller percentages. So it's definitely New York number 1, then California, then Texas, and then Massachusetts. And then after that, we've got 2 in Arizona, 4 in Michigan, 3 that took place in DC, 1 in Mississippi, 1 in Maine, 1 in Rhode Island, 6 in Virginia, which seems kind of high, but that's just because I read The Raven Cycle in 2019, so that took up 5 of those slots. Then we've got 1 in Connecticut, 2 in North Carolina, 1 in Indiana, 1 in Maryland, 1 in New Jersey, and 1 in Arkansas. I would love to read a book from every single US state. Probably I have at this point done this already, but I haven't been tracking this until now. So from this point on, I would really, really like to read a book in every single state. I think that would be fun. But I covered a lot of them. I'm pretty impressed by the range that we have here. Next, we have gender. So I broke down the gender representation by the combination of the gender of the person writing the book and then the gender of the protagonist in the book, which is something that I'm going to do differently in 2020. I just feel like the way that this turned out is kind of confusing. So I'm going to be looking at this same information next year, but I'm going to be breaking it down kind of into separate categories. But anyway, this is how I tracked it in 2019. We have 52 books that were a female author writing a female protagonist. Not surprising to me, I gravitate toward female protagonists and female authors, and obviously the two are going to combine more often than not. 13 books written by a female author writing a male protagonist. 16 books from a male author writing a male protagonist. 7 books from a male author writing a female protagonist. I had 1 book from multiple authors writing a female protagonist. 18 books from a female author writing multiple protagonists. And then 7 books from a male author writing multiple protagonists. That's very confusing. As you can see, I didn't break this down in a way that makes a lot of sense. And then I also have 2 books that I wrote were a female author writing a non-applicable protagonist. I'm pretty sure that those were nonfiction novels where it didn't have a specific focus. As you can see, I mostly read books written by women and written about women. That's going to be the main takeaway from this. In looking at what books I read that took place in series, we have 67 standalone novels, so that's definitely the majority of the books. I did read 22 books that were the first book in a series, 15 that were the second in a series, 6 that were the third in a series, 4 that were the fourth in a series, and then 1 book was the fifth in a series. And then I also read 1 book that technically qualifies as 4.5 in a series. So this is, again, not super surprising. I mostly read standalones, and then obviously it's more heavily skewed to the earlier books in a series, and it just kind of dwindles down from that. Out of all the authors I read, 60 of them were authors that I was reading for the first time, and then 56 of them were authors that I have read before. So that's pretty evenly split down the middle, with a little bit more of an edge to trying authors for the first time, and I'm pretty happy with that. I obviously love trying out new authors, but I love returning to old favorite authors, and I think a pretty even split is a decent way to go about things. I kept track of whether a book made me cry, which is a little bit subjective, and I didn't always fully remember, but I did my best to try to keep this as accurate as possible. We have 80 books that didn't make me cry, and then 36 that did, which honestly, I would expect that number to be higher. I feel like I cry a lot during books, but I guess I didn't read as many tearjerkers as I thought I did. Only 36 books made me cry, which, I mean, that's a lot of books. It's a lot of crying, but I cry very easily when I'm reading books. So now we are getting into all of the diversity in the books that I was reading. I love looking at this. First off, we're going to start out with sexual diversity and different sexual orientations. I am kind of sad to report that 74 of the books that I read didn't really have any sort of significant representation. 24 of the books I read had significant secondary characters as the most representation in the book. And then 18 of the books that I read, the most representation we got was a queer protagonist. So obviously I mostly am not reading queer fiction, even though I would love to be. And I obviously love books with LGBT representation, and I love seeking them out, and it's something that I clearly need to do even more than I already do, because for the most part I'm not reading queer literature, and I would love to be. Obviously this is more of an issue with publishing than it is for me, I think, but it is something that I would like to focus more on, because it's something that I champion a lot, something that I care about a lot, but that didn't happen as much as I thought it did in 2019. I did try to keep track of all of the different identities that were represented in the books I was reading. So I read 14 books that had a non-specified queer female character, 11 books with a queer male character who didn't really have a specified identity, same situation. 16 books that I read had a character in them who was gay. So specifically, I'm talking about male characters. I kind of separated these books by gender because I was curious if the breakdown would be different. It actually was. There were 16 books with a gay character and then 7 books with a lesbian character. So that number was definitely a lot higher for the male representation. I also was looking at bisexual representation between men and women. So there were 5 books that I read with a bisexual male character and 7 books with a bisexual female character. I read 3 books that had asexual representation, 5 books that had non-binary representation, which is honestly more than I expected. I'm really excited to see non-binary representation actually appearing in literature. And then I believe that the last category I have is 3 books that I read had trans female characters. I didn't read any books with male characters who are trans. I only read 3 books with a female trans character and then the 5 books with non-binary characters. So that actually was pretty interesting to me, and that's something that I would like to think about as well, is more books about trans characters in general, but specifically the experience of being transgender and male, because I didn't read a single book with a male trans character all year, which is kind of wild to me. One thing I do want to note is that for all of these identities that I'm mentioning, if a book had more than one character with that identity, I only marked it once. So I basically was just trying to keep track of how many different books had each identity's representation at all, not how many characters with a specific identity. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. Moving into racial diversity, 60 books that I read had no significant racial diversity. Of course, a lot of the books that I read don't mention race at all, so you could read the characters as any sort of way you want to, but I cannot count that as representation. Again, most of the books not having any representation, it's not good enough. Anyway, 34 of the books I read had people of color in prominent secondary character roles as the most representation in the book, and then 22 of the books I read had a protagonist who is a person of color. I, again, was looking at the identities represented in the books I was reading, but for sexual orientation, I was looking at both the secondary and the main characters. For racial diversity, I just found that to be too difficult to try to figure out, so I was only looking at the protagonists. So for the 22 books that I read with a protagonist who is a person of color, 8 of them featured a Black protagonist, 3 of them featured a Filipino protagonist, 3 of them featured an Indian protagonist, 4 of them featured a Mexican protagonist, 1 had a Persian protagonist, 1 had a Puerto Rican protagonist, 1 had a Japanese protagonist, and 1 had a Dominican protagonist. When you really break it down like that, I feel like I wasn't reading very diversely at all. I definitely need to focus on this again more in 2020. When you look at it just like book by book, that's hardly anything at all. And it just, I don't know, that's not good enough. I also try to keep track of the authors that I'm reading, if I'm reading books by people of color or not, and 96 of the books I read were, to my knowledge, written by white authors, and 20 of the books I read were written by people of color, which is just, that's just not good. I have implemented reading projects in the past that made me read more authors of color, and I haven't been doing that this year, and maybe I should again, because I'm just not happy with that at all. I also was looking at mental illness and disability representation in the books that I was reading. So 15 of the books I read had prominent mental illness representation. 101 of them had no real mental illness representation at all. Of the books that I read, 2 of them had mental illness representation, but I truly didn't know what the specific mental illnesses were. We had 1 book that featured schizophrenia, 1 that featured Munchausen syndrome, 2 books that focused on addiction, 4 books that focused on PTSD, 3 books that focused on depression, and then 2 that focused on anxiety. I also looked at disability representation. 106 of the books I read had no disability representation, and 10 of them did. Not super surprising, but it is disappointing. I read 4 books that had representation of somebody with an amputated leg, and that is because I read the Cormoran Strike series, and the main character of that book series only has 1 leg. And then after that, we have 1 book that had an autistic character, 1 book that had a blind character, 1 book that had a character who had a leg injury that caused them to have chronic mobility issues, 1 book that had a character that had severe arthritis that also caused mobility issues and they used crutches. 1 book I read had a character with face blindness. I don't know if this is officially considered a disability, but I kind of consider it to be one because severe face blindness really can drastically affect your life. And then I read 1 book that had a character with some sort of developmental disability. It wasn't really stated specifically what that was. So yeah, not a lot of disability representation either. Moving into some more general stats, I broke down the books that I was reading based on like the format of them. So 87 of the books that I read were just regular novels. I read 2 novellas, 8 picture books, 9 graphic novels, 4 essays, 1 short story collection, 1 book in verse, and 4 poetry collections. I also sadly initially wrote down a section for plays, and I didn't read any plays, so that's something I would like to do in 2020 is read a play, because it's obviously been a while since I read one. But for the most part, again, not a super surprising breakdown. I'm mostly just reading regular old books, but I would like to be reading more graphic novels. That I feel like has kind of taken a dip in the past year. I usually run a personal readathon called the Week of Graphic Novels. I've done that yearly for a few years, but I don't think I did it in 2019. So that's something I think I want to bring back in 2020 is participating in my own personal Week of Graphic Novels readathon, and then I'll probably read a lot more graphic novels in 2020 if I do that. 87 of the books that I read were unowned at the time of my reading them, and 30 of them were owned. This is another stat that you have already gleaned from my goals in review, because obviously I needed to look at the books that I read that were owned versus unowned, because that was one of my reading goals. Sadly, only 26% of the books I read were already owned, which is not meeting my goal, but we've been over that. This is what that graph looks like. I'm sorry, I didn't do as well on this as I wanted to. Curious to see how it all breaks down in 2020. 97 of the books I read, I was reading for the first time, and 19 of them were rereads. And then I did keep track of translated books versus books that were written in English. But to nobody's surprise, I only read 2 translated books, so really hardly any at all. I always say I want to read more translated fiction and then I don't do it. So that's something that I do need to keep in mind for potentially creating like a specific goal for, and really focusing on 1 year, is to read more translated books. Maybe in 2021, I'll do a project where I try to read more translated books and more books that take place in countries outside of the United States, because I feel like those will kind of go hand in hand in terms of goals. That potentially could be a good project. For those of you that remember when I posted my Women in Translation readathon TBR. I obviously didn't participate in that readathon. I made a TBR for it. I wanted to participate, but it happened during the last week of Veda, and I was hoping to be finished with the videos for that week, and then I would be able to participate in the readathon, but I did not finish the videos for that week, so all of my free time was spent making videos for the last week of Veda, and I literally had no time to read whatsoever, so I didn't read anything off my TBR for that readathon. And then the last 2 things that I have kept track of are repeat authors for the year, and then something new that I kept track of this year was what publishers I was reading. So that's something I was actually really excited about, was keeping track of what publishing companies I was reading from. I was really hoping to find trends and find publishing houses that I didn't realize I loved, and that just is not the experience that I had in keeping track of the publishers I was reading. I don't even want to read like the results of this, because it's literally just going to be me listing off like a million publishers. I'll include footage of what this page in my notebook looks like, but basically I read from tons of different publishers, and most of them I was just reading like 1 to 3 books from them, and it just like, it was not eye-opening at all. The most I read from any publisher was like 5 or 6. I read 5 books from Scholastic, 5 from HarperCollins, 6 books from Delacorte Press. But for the most part, what I think was happening was that I was reading books in series, and obviously the series were all published by the same publisher. So like any series that I read just made it look like I was reading a bunch of books from one specific publisher. And even then, like there was no publisher that I read a significant amount of books from. So I was honestly very disappointed by the results for this. I decided that I will continue to keep track of it in 2020, just to see if anything changes or if I notice anything new from it, because just doing it for 1 year I feel like is not going to give me significant enough results for me to decide not to keep track of what publishers I was reading. Which leaves me with the last bit of information I have for you, which is my repeat authors. And again, I'm actually a little disappointed by the repeat authors list that I have, because literally all of the repeat authors I have are just because I read books that are in a specific series by that author. So obviously I read multiple books by this author because I read a series by them that had 2 books or 3 books or 4 books. It didn't end up really showing me anything interesting, but I will read off the authors to you just to give you a look at the repeat authors I had. So for a total of 2 books, I read 2 books by Scott Westerfeld, Maureen Johnson, Taro Gomi, Rachel Hawkins, Julie Murphy, Alice Oseman, and Catherine Arden. I read 3 books by Susan Beth Pfeffer and Matt Goldman. I read 4 books by Sarah Milanowski. I read 5 books by Maggie Stiefvater. 6 books by J.K. Rowling / Robert Galbraith. 2 different author names, but it's literally the same person, so I just categorized them together. So that was 6 books. She was almost my top author this year, but she was edged out by one person. My top author of the year with 7 books was Bruce Coville, which just makes me happy. I love Bruce Coville. I am super happy to have him be my top author of the year. He deserves that spot. He really, really treated me well with the books that I read by him this year. So yeah, those were all of my repeat authors of 2019. I think in 2020, I would like to have more authors on my repeat author list that are just authors who write standalone books, and I got to read multiple books by an author that are unrelated to one another. So that's something that I would like to do in 2020 as well, that I didn't realize I wanted to do, but I know that now from looking at my stats. And that is why I love book statistics. Alrighty, that is it. I love looking at book statistics. I love looking at reading statistics. I hope you do too. I hope you enjoyed this. I always have fun making this video and looking back on it year to year. Thank you very much for watching. I will see you guys soon. Okay, bye.